Welcome to Adaptive Design in MR or XR, UX Problems and Solutions. So my name is Jada Williams. I am a UX designer, design lead at Microsoft, and I work on a mixed reality app called Microsoft Dynamics 365 Layout, which I will refer to as Layout for short. And this is not only a HoloLens app, but it's an immersive experience that allows space designers to view their designs in 3D, whether that is a factory floor, a retail store, a hospital. We're working with enterprises so that they can view their designs in the context of the space that they're designing for. And by me, I mean I am not the only designer on my team by far. I am fortunate enough to work with a great many talented folks. These are all the other artists and designers on my team, and if there's anything beautiful in the app or the deck, it is probably made by one of them. This is not only a story about my design process, but also our entire team's design process. So, as you can see, I have a really diverse team. We all come from different walks of life. We all bring different perspectives, and I bring definitely a different perspective than some of the other folks on the team. I don't come from what would be the more typical background for MR, at least from my team's diversity level. I bring 2D. So I don't come from games. I don't come from cinema or architecture. I come from the very flat world of 2D, of web and mobile design. Not even games, guys. And I won't lie, there's been a couple of times now that I'm in the MR world and designing in 3D with my 2D background, I've felt a little lost. But when it came to converting our HoloLens app into VR, I actually felt like, hey, I feel like I've kind of done this before. This is actually not too dissimilar from my background of responsive and adaptive design in web, where you're trying to make one thing work for multiple devices. So that really helped me. But how did we actually realize that we needed to convert our HoloLens app to VR? So for that, we went back to our customers, and we have a user-centered design process. And when I say that, we've always worked with customers in this product. From the very initial phases of this product, we basically went out and decided that we were going to find some customers or people we wanted to be our customers and pull them in as our partners. So we have them sign NDAs, they come on board, and they essentially help us design this product. So the very first, we have a few partners that we initially started with. And the first time we get a partner, we bring them in, we do what we call contextual inquiry. And what that means is we go on site, we watch them do the things that they do and the tools that they normally do them in the environment that they're normally in. And we ask them a ton of questions while we're there. And then we assess their user needs. We kind of figure out what problems we can help them solve and do some designs around that. And then we get their feedback. And we iterate, and we feedback, and iterate, and feedback, and iterate. And that process has worked really great for us so far. It's been really helpful in guiding our team to make sure we're working on a product that we think will actually be beneficial for our customers in the long run. And it's something I really highly recommend for any of you guys out there that are new to a product, if you're in a startup, even if you've been doing a product for a while and you're not getting that customer engagement. This has been really useful to us. So we originally built this just in HoloLens because, quite honestly, it just made sense. We were talking to our space planners, and they work in 2D floor plans, and they themselves have they can kind of understand it, but explaining it to someone else is sometimes a hard problem. And you can see in the video here, there's sometimes where you're like, oh, the forklift does fit there. Oh, I did need to move it over 3 feet. That's kind of not something they're able to get from their 2D plans. And right now, they actually have a problem visualizing it. So what they do is the same thing we do when we have a problem that we can't wrap our brains around. They prototype. But they don't prototype the way we do. They prototype using foam core and cardboard. And I'm talking a lot of cardboard. We have more than one of our partners that spends over $1 million a year on prototyping materials alone. So this is where HoloLens and holograms just made sense. We can save some money, we can maybe save the environment. And as we were talking to these customers about why they're prototyping, they're doing it because they're not able to see sight lines in 2D. They need to understand if they're sitting at a desk, are they going to be able to look to that door and see it? They need to understand, if I reach over here and walk 10 feet that way, am I going to be able to do that? So they'll prototype. And the more we understood about their prototyping, the more we learned that maybe there's some additional challenges they're facing. So one thing we learned was not everyone has access to the space they're actually designing for. There's many space designers that are working in one area of the country and perhaps designing for another area in another country, or maybe another part of the globe, or maybe it doesn't even exist anymore, or yet, it hasn't been built yet. Then there's also a use case we found where it's not very safe to be in that area for an extended period of time. So while HoloLens is really great, if you're in that space, it's not super helpful if you don't have access to it or you don't actually have a duplicate of that factory that you're building. So we found that this was going to be a perfect use case for our immersive headsets or our VR headsets. So going back to our user-centered design process, we did a really quick prototype and really fast and dirty converted our HoloLens app over to VR, showed it to our partners, and sure enough, they jumped at the idea of being able to design in 3D from anywhere. So now we knew we were headed in the right direction, but it had a lot of questions that kind of popped up. Of course, how do you convert a HoloLens app into VR? They have different FOVs, different input systems, different ergonomics. Do you design for consistency or do you design for the platform? So a lot of those questions reminded me of my past life in 2D and mobile. So this was something that we had to do back then. So about 10 years ago when I was just a web designer, we had to solve a similar problem. So mobile was becoming more important, but most people were designing for desktops. And their desktop apps or websites were not looking super great on their mobile phones. So the first thing that they did was they built a website specifically just for mobile. And these became m.websites.com. The problem with this was that you're maintaining two different code bases. And that was something as layout we didn't want to do. We wanted to make sure when we were building this, we were maintaining one code base for multiple devices. So how this was solved for in web and mobile was responsive and adaptive design. And some of you might have heard those terms. You may not come from my 2D world. But responsive and adaptive design are essentially make the design work for the medium or the device that you're in. Responsive is a fluid design system, so it means that it takes the content and it matches it to your screen size. It'll either stretch it or squish it. Adaptive is also responsive. It just takes it one step further. It's a little bit more thoughtful. It shows you the content that you need in the context that you're in. So an example of this might be a travel website. You are on your desktop, you see some great photos, but when you're on your mobile, you actually need to take some actions. You need to be able to plan or book your travel. So you're making sure you're seeing the context and the content in the context that you need it in. So once we'd figured out how to do it from a technology standpoint, we were also thinking about it from a design standpoint. So initially when people were designing, they were designing for the desktop. And then they were dissecting that design and moving it down to mobile. And what we found was that there were some mobile devices or experiences that just didn't work quite as well because they were kind of secondary thoughts. So a design philosophy that came about in our world was called mobile first. And what you do is then you design for the simplest of the two systems and you make an additive design process. So we kind of got lucky in that respect that we built ours for HoloLens. So it was somewhat HoloLens first, and we're able to do an additive design through our process. All right, so let's go back to that question of do we design for consistency or do we design for the platform? And if we think about it from an input system. Well, this wasn't my first rodeo in inputs. I'd actually dealt with this before. In mobile, we have touch and gesture, and in desktop, we have the cursor and the mouse. So you have the same interface, but you have different inputs. So an example of this might be a map app on your phone. So to zoom in, you're going to pinch and zoom on your mobile, and for desktop, you're going to double click, or maybe you'll use the slider on your mouse. So we too have this. We have gesture in HoloLens. You can air tap, and you can air tap and hold. And then you have the controllers. We're using the Windows Mixed Reality controllers with 6 stuff, and they have 6 different inputs, 2 different controllers. So you got to think, okay, so how do we map those inputs, knowing that there's differences in them? So again, we went back to our user-centered design process. We had to figure out who was going to be using the HoloLens and who was going to be using the VR. And we knew the people that wanted to see it in context were going to be using it in a HoloLens, and that some of the people who were not were going to be in VR. What we didn't know necessarily was the overlap. We knew from our small partner base that there was going to be some overlap, but we didn't know what that delta was going to be. So we decided to lean towards design consistency and making sure the experience at least felt the same if you were putting on a HoloLens app and then immediately putting on a headset. So for that reason, we kept to very limited input systems in our 6-off controllers. We literally only had 2 to start with. So we had the joystick that came over from our OS. So if you are in the mixed reality portal and you are teleporting around in our cliff house, you're going to use the thumbs on your joystick to get around. And we wanted to make sure we kept that pattern consistent and it was the same and we weren't teaching something different. The other input system that we have is our trigger. And that matches up nicely. It's almost a one-to-one with AirTap. So that's how we decided to implement it on a one-to-one. But of course, while you have great plans of a one-to-one, sometimes it doesn't work out quite that straightforward. Some interactions just feel better differently. And we kind of discovered this. One prime example of this is in HoloLens. If you want to pull a model or something out of our menu, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the menu and you're going to gaze at the model that you want. You're going to AirTap. That model is then placed on your gaze. And when you look around, find out where you want it, AirTap again. That's how you do it. So we map that exactly to VR. So our controller, you're going to point your ray at the menu. You're going to pull the trigger, it's attached to your ray. You're going to point where you want it, pull the trigger again. However, when we actually observed our customers doing this for the first time, it wasn't super intuitive to them. And I'm talking not even only our customers, but people who actually developed and built our app had different ideas of what they want the interaction to be in VR. So what we observed happening the first time they tried it in VR was they would pull the trigger, keep it closed, and kind of let it go. And I don't know if this has to do with a mental model of grabbing and releasing that's more obvious in VR, that's not as obvious in HoloLens, but we decided to make the change so that it was an adaptive solution. And when you're in VR, you actually have a different interaction. You're going to pull it, release, and let go. So again, our learning is you can plan for a one-to-one input, but you need to make sure you're testing it on different devices because you may need to actually adjust some of the interactions as you go along. Different ergonomics is another thing that kind of came up when I was thinking about this. But this wasn't that dissimilar from my world of mobile and web. I did have to think about ergonomics there as well. So when I was dealing with your desktop, it doesn't really matter on your mouse if you're using hand dominance anyway. It doesn't matter if you're using your right hand or your left hand. And the same thing with HoloLens. You can AirTap with your right hand, left hand, no biggie. But when you are using your mobile phone, you need to think about hand dominance for the ergonomic thumb. It depends on which hand you're holding on and which it's easier for your thumb to kind of make movement over. So you got to make sure you're designing for that middle area, neutral zone, when you're designing in mobile. And we had to think about hand dominance for our controllers because we actually attach the menu to one of the controllers and the other one is used for pointing a lot. And it can be really uncomfortable to point something with your non-dominant hand. And of course, we defaulted it to right-handed people, sorry, lefties. So there has to be a way to switch the menu from one controller to the next. The great thing is we have all these input systems we're not using, so let's use one of them, was our first reaction. There's actually a little menu button that you can see that's between the joystick and the thumb pad. That was our first idea, we'll just make it a menu. However, funny story, our customers are not actually early adapters. They're not super familiar with the controls. As a matter of fact, the first time most of our customers had ever tried a VR device was the first time we walked into their office with it. Now that's not 100% true. There were a couple of our partners that had VR devices in the corner, but they're not out there playing Beat Saber on the weekends. They're not super familiar with the controls. So our first idea was to just press the menu button and it would bring it up. But I had a couple questions about how that interaction would work. If I'm holding the controllers, do I press this one and it comes over here? Does it matter which one I press? I didn't 100% know, so of course I went back, talked to our customers, I put 2 controllers in their hands, and I said, how would you switch the menu from one controller to the next? And when I was doing some research for this, there's some really cool interactions out there. Google Blocks allows you to like bump the controllers and switch it. I gotta tell you, none of our customers did that. As a matter of fact, 80% of them didn't really do anything with the controllers. They saw that there was a settings menu, button on the menu, and they said it would be right there. So, lesson learned, instead of adding an additional input system, it was important for us to understand not only what was parity with other tools out there, but what was the customer's expectation from the experience, and even if it's not the super cool idea. There's many other places we chose to keep the UI consistent for that unknown overlap of users. We really tried to do it throughout the app. A lot of the main interactions in our app do this. So for example, if you need to rotate an object in our app in HoloLens, what you're going to do is you're going to gaze at the arrow, you're going to air tap, and it does a quick 90-degree rotation. In VR, we kept it the same. Even though there's some patterns where you have two controllers and you can just rotate this way, we didn't want to teach different interactions to our users. So what you can do in VR is you point your ray, pull the trigger, and it works the same way. However, again, not everything is super straightforward. We found that it's a lot more difficult to hit a small target in VR, and that has to do with the input system that we chose. So we chose the trigger, and when you're holding the controller and you pull that trigger, it ever so slightly moves your controller. So if something is really far away, it's a little more difficult to hit. So we did an adaptive design solution, and we added a threshold into VR. And what that means is it's a sticky factor. So in HoloLens, when you're gazing an arrow, it's fine. You just kind of gaze at it. In VR, when you're running your pointer over the actual arrow, there's a sticky factor. So it's kind of like it sticks to it a little bit. So that way when you're pointing it and at a long distance, it hits it a little bit better. So again, you can think of a one-to-one input, but you've got to make sure you're designing or you're testing those two different devices. So adaptive menu. So menus are something that I don't know if we ever truly solved perfectly in my 2D world, but one thing that was really popular was a responsive menu system. So we had to think about how do we design for a big and a small screen. And the solution that they kind of came up with is called a hamburger menu. It's called that because it looks like 3 bars and looks like a hamburger. It's one of those really divisive, people love it or hate it in the 2D world. I don't know if it absolutely solves the problem, but it made me think of that. We haven't quite solved ours either. We have to make sure when we were designing our menus that we were doing one menu system. We didn't want to maintain 2 different menu systems for our app. But we also knew there was a problem from that initial VR prototype that we did. So when our app has a world lock menu. And what that means is if I'm looking at my menu, I air tap, it stays right there. I can walk away, I can get closer. It has a billboarding effects, it turns with you, it gets smaller and bigger. It works really great in HoloLens. However, when we did our VR one, you lose a little bit of the affordances in VR that you have in AR. You can get lost a lot easier, you lose a sense of direction, you teleport, and because you teleport around, you can go further faster. So what we found was people were kind of losing their menus. They would jump from one side of the room to the next, and it was too hard to target. So there's some simple solutions to this. We could have just said, hey, we just need to recall our menu. We could have been like, come on over, menu. But we don't actually have any audio actions, so that didn't really work for us. We thought about, okay, well, we can add an input system. But we also know that input systems were not super intuitive to our users. But if we did add an input system, even then we had to think a little bit about the logic. Where does it spawn when it comes back to you? Is it going to be like 2 feet in front of you? What if you're in front of a wall? There has to be some logic there. So at the time, we just didn't have the time to make this a really great experience. So we decided to look around and see what some other folks out there were doing. And one of the other common patterns is body locked menus. So a couple of people that are doing this, Rec Room, they've got the watch on the wrist. And in Tilt Brush, they've got the palette right there on the controller. So we took a page out of their book, and we decided to add our menu onto the controller. And this worked for us because we were able to maintain the UI. It's the exact same UI in HoloLens as it is in VR. And that means we're maintaining the same code base. So was this ideal? Was this not? I would tell you, we are still pushing forward on menu solutions. We're still iterating. We're still figuring that out. But I think one of the main learnings we did find is that a world lock menu works better in HoloLens, at least for us, and a body lock menu was working better in VR. All right, so through all of this, what was my main takeaway? What was kind of like the biggest thing that I kind of learned? And some of this was based on assumptions. So an early assumption we made was kind of understanding who is going to be using our app. We now have more data. So we launched our app into beta, or what we call preview, back in May. So, and also we actually launched the app officially to the store at the very first of this month. So we've gotten a lot more data about who is using our app and how they're using our app. And one thing we've seen that is if you are a HoloLens user, you're predominantly using it in context in HoloLens. And if you're a VR user, you're predominantly using it in VR. And that overlap isn't, the people who are using it in both, isn't as significant as we thought it was going to be. So moving forward, we want to make sure that we're going to start pushing the platform. And what I mean is when you're in VR, we want to make sure that's the best VR experience that we can make. And when you're in HoloLens, it's the best too. Although we do have to walk a fine line that we are still only maintaining one code base. So we don't want so many if, then, or statements that we're essentially building a second app in VR. So that's our challenge moving forward. And some of you guys are like, well, those are some really great stories, Jada, but how is this relevant to me? And I just want to point out and remind you that we didn't build this intending to make a multi-mixed reality device or app. We were just making this for HoloLens. And it wasn't until we talked to our customers more and found some different use cases that we learned more. And so maybe some of you guys are in the same boat. Maybe you don't know all the use cases from your customers yet. I think the other thing to kind of think about is that it feels like pretty much every other week there's a new set of glasses, a new HMD, a new headset coming out. And that some of those use cases that you initially had, they can be solved in the hardware that you're either in, but maybe now with new hardware, doors are opening on how you're going to be able to solve some of these customer problems. So I want to leave you with one final thought. I think that we do need to kind of figure out with all the new devices and all the new experiences that we have on how to do an adaptive world in mixed reality. But we also need to be cognizant of what's already been out there. We know that web and mobile has already solved for, maybe there's some other games ones. So instead of reinventing the wheel, let's improve upon it and think about how we can make more of an adaptive mixed reality or XR world in the future. All right, with that I'm happy to take any questions about my design process, about layout. Got one over here.
So far, the role of the body lock UI on running the same problem with the intersection and with spaces in the slide, it seems like those are the open space. The user turning and intersecting the environment
I guess I'm not. You're asking about world intersection. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking.
So to the field,
Right.
you said that body lock UI
Yes.
is perfect.
Yes.
How do you know this one? How would you do intersecting?
Oh, body locked. Well, if it's body locked to your controller, so you have you know where your controller is, and there's some intersection stuff if you're too close to the wall, but it doesn't. It's not usually a problem. People are very cognizant; they can see it, so they're kind of almost keeping it out of the way, even in the virtual environment. Well, we didn't actually see it as a problem. We didn't when we were testing it out. That didn't seem to be a thing that anyone had any problems with, that we observed anyway. Yeah. One question over here.
Hi, just a couple questions here. First of all, do you have a release date for the new HoloLens?
I don't work on the hardware team, so I can't tell you any dates about HoloLens.
That's always worth it.
I'm on the lowly software team.
I thought I would ask, you never know what answer you get. Second is, something I've been really impatient with is, this notion that, like kind of following your train of thought, well, like every week there's some new announcement of some new hardware, and then yet to go with it is some new way of having to interact with it. And really, I just want to dispense with all of it, the gaze, gesture, voice, that whole thing, and just do things naturally and map my real world actions into a, augmented world reaction so that I can literally grab something with my hand. I know most people's hands have 5 fingers, and so it seems like there should be enough computing power to figure out that I have a hand, and when I squeeze it, I'm picking something up or something like that, And so, can you maybe help me appreciate or understand why that's such a challenge and why we can't just move to a real world interaction?
I mean, I can't answer that from a hardware standpoint. I don't know if the hardware is 100% there yet. I think one problem that brings about is that's also a close world. So what I'm dealing with in my app is we're in a very large environment, or they want to design for this entire room. And me myself, I don't necessarily want to go and place every chair and walk to that chair. I want to be able to stand here and be able to do it all from here. If it was just touch for my app, I would literally have to move farther and do more. So I don't know if that solution, while it's really helpful for certain use cases, when you're wanting to see things close to you and you're wanting to do that, but we're not necessarily going to be able, that doesn't really work for our app and helping our users do things quicker. Are there any, okay, there's one question over here.
How big were your users in terms of having to testing? So how big were the groups?
Oh, or like our user groups. So we do different types of testing. We have our partners themselves. We usually have contact with about 4 or 5 people per company, and then that's the group that will go out when we have questions specifically about the product. But then we also have UR testing in-house, where we'll bring in people who are either local, and that's more about the usability. That's more, and then there'll usually be 5 or 6 of those to make sure, okay, people seem to have an idea they can make this thing go. That's more about the usability. But when we have specific product questions, we make sure to go out to our actual partners and show them and get those actual questions. One question back here.
So you mentioned briefly that for VR you didn't have voice, so that wasn't a solution. But with in AR, did you initially have any voice?
We don't actually have voice activation in HoloLens either, but it is something we were working on, especially with some accessibility considerations that we have. So we're on it already. We just didn't have it at the time, and we technically don't have it just yet. The clicker is only for air tapping. So we have 2 gestures that are predominant in our app, which is air tap and hold. So the clicker only works for one of those 2. Yeah, you need to be able to, it's not a 6-stop. Yeah, there, yeah.
This is just more of a general design suggestion from you. How do you strike the balance of, like, I think like the general was talking about having real life, but computers are also supposed to make things easier for us to do. So as an example, crumbling a piece of paper and throwing it in the trash can, although cool, after a while it becomes like, well, that's too many steps. Let me just click on it and it just goes away, right? So how do you strike a balance in VR, just as a design philosophy, between mapping real world but not making it where it just becomes hard to work?
I mean, I think we at least try to do that by observing. I mean, some of that we can do that, we're not necessarily observing our partners, but observing the UR stuff and actually seeing the time it takes to do stuff. And if it feels like it's taking longer than it would. Our goal with this app is to make their lives easier. This is definitely a product, not a game. And the goal is to make it so that they want to buy our product because it's simplifying their lives. So we make sure to be very cognizant about what we're doing, especially in HoloLens. We have to make sure, okay, they're having to do 3 or 5 different clicks to get to this thing. Is that really more helpful? So we're really cognizant of how we're designing it to make it so it still may be more clicks than we want, but that it's simplifying at least the experience they already have today. I mean, right now, that's how we're doing it. Unless anyone else has any other. Yeah. Any other questions from the crew? All right.
It might sound like a knock against the HoloLens, but we use it, we like it.
I didn't build it. I'm not going to take it personally.
Did you find that translating the UI from when you get in a HoloLens to VR, did you change anything there to take advantage of the larger footprint in the VR space?
I mean, I think this is why I kind of brought up that one point, which I don't know if it really hit home or anything for anyone, but it's that mobile first concept. So when we are doing designs, we are looking at it in HoloLens first because we want to make sure it fits in that smaller FOV and that they're able to do everything there. And once we figure out that experience, we're able to kind of open up our design thinking a little bit and see, well, how can we push this a little bit further in VR? But we are still somewhat limited in making sure that we don't want completely different experiences in both right now to maintain the one code base.
Did any of the VR users give you feedback, like, why is this UI this way, or
I mean, not really. Like I said, our customers are not like the early adapters that are in there like being like, oh my gosh, why don't you have it working like this? They're not enough, they don't know enough to know that that might be a possibility. And sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's not. So we haven't really gotten any feedback about that. Is there, oh wait, okay, I'll come back to you.
Is there any, continuing with your question, is there any preference between using HoloLens or using a MR system?
I think, again, it goes back to the use case. So it's really one of those things where, what are you trying to do? And if you're trying to view it in context, we find a lot, it's amazing to me when you talk to people, space planners, how many floor plans are out of date. So they'll get updated, they won't update their floor plans as much, or they don't trust them as much. So they'll do a design, and then they'll go on site and realize, oh, there's a giant pipe in the way. That's not supposed to be there. It wasn't on the floor plan. So I think in those cases, HoloLens makes way more sense. But then again, there's still a large group of people that actually are not able to go on site for whatever reason. And they do find it helpful to be able to visualize in 3D and be able to test some of those sight lines, some of those other things. And that's when they're going to use it in VR. Yeah. There's also some, like, it could be a little faster sometimes to do stuff in VR with the 6-off controllers. So there's some additional benefits. Sometimes you can design something in VR, move it over to your HoloLens real fast, and do it that way too. Although you can do both, and everything in both.
Is this only an enterprise software right now?
I mean, enterprise is who our audience is and who we're talking to, but hypothetically anyone can buy it. We've had, the preview is free, but we have now since launched. So you can get it free. But, yep, now we're going to sell it. I mean, we have the full size room in there, but no one, honestly, when we observe people, they don't walk as much as I thought they would. It's as soon as they figure out that teleportation, which does take them sometimes a little bit more to learn, they stop walking around. So I think even if we had an untethered solution, I don't know if they would be walking that far based on just what I've observed from our customers. All right, I'm not exactly sure where we are with time, but if there's any other questions? If not, thanks for coming. I know that I'm supposed to remind you guys to fill out the surveys, and if you guys have any questions for me, you can reach me on Twitter, or I'll be around a little bit after the talk as well. So thank you.